Um, so it's a good transition from Petra Kelly and her commentary to contemporary socialist projects. Whether we agree with their models or not, a lot can be learned from socialist projects of the past and present. Notice on here the large socialist projects, Soviet Union, China, aren't listed because we got more into them deeper into it in our discussion of Marxism and on the previous ones, right? So I didn't want to take up space on a single slide for things that we had gone deeper in than we would tonight on another one, right? But the first Eco-Socialist International Plan was largely written by indigenous folks from the global South, right? Oops. It provides a strategy and a plan for action. Was published in 2017, and it's a good model of an eco-socialist future that isn't guided by the West, right? And we can see what happens when the West guides by looking at like the COP negotiations, right? Where the U.S. is the one that's killing any kind of real teeth to enforcement and anything like that. The ELZN, the Zapatistas, right? There's a link there for the principles of the Zapatista movement. Chairman Marco did a really good piece that was 10 years. Yeah, Yabasta, 10 years of the Zapatista uprising, Subcomandante Marcos. I've got a really good long book with the history that I can't remember who it's by to look for to grab. But right, and the Zapatistas are, a great model for bottom up. Organizing and bottom-up socialism, indigenous-led socialism, right? They are a great model for, art and beauty in revolution. I actually, when I was a senior in high school, I was taking a political science class, and our final paper was to write a research paper on a terrorist organization. And this was in the early 2000s. And the Zapatistas were on the list. And so I went to my teacher and I said, I'm going to do the Zapatistas, but I'm going to write a paper about why they shouldn't be on this list. And I did, and she removed them for future years from the list because I was able to make a compelling case that they weren't a terrorist organization as the West and as the Mexican government wanted them branded, but they were a revolutionary organization. They were a liberation movement. They took over a whole region of Mexico that was indigenously populated and was traditionally oppressed and forgotten about, right? They didn't have access to services, they didn't have access to things, and they took it over with mostly fake guns, right? They took it over and they read poetry from the balconies, right? And while they were reading the poetry, they also established medical systems that exist today, right? They achieved a level of autonomy that allows us to look to them, right, and to see what on a small scale can be done. That said, it's a single region of Mexico, right? So there's some shortcomings in its applying its lessons to a broad movement in the United States or globally, right? But there's a lot of really valuable lessons that can be learned. And a lot of, I think when we see places get this kind of autonomy and get the opportunity to try out, tactics, strategies, policies, it's important that we look to them. And the Zapatistas have long been an inspiration for the bottom left, and so that it's not surprising that they would be on this list. A similar kind of...
Before you move on, I wanted to kind of note about those principles that... kind of in keeping with what we've been talking about, it's a really short document that has just kind of an outline. It's like 2 pages. But the principles that the Zapatistas try to follow are very good. They're very non-hierarchical, and they put a huge emphasis on communities coming together to discuss, to deliberate, to doing education to make sure everyone is in the loop, and to making sure that information is available to everyone, that all decisions and processes are very transparent and available to everyone, and that it's not pushed by anyone, right? It's not pushed from top down, that every decision is made from the community levels bottom up, and that when they weren't sure about things, they would send representatives to communities to talk to people there directly and ask them about their thoughts and make sure that all of that was included in the decision-making process. And all of that, I think, are really great principles for us to take to heart in the U.S., that a lot of our organizing, which next month, Organizing 101, a lot of our organizing should really be along those similar lines, that we need to do deep canvassing type stuff where we're going to our communities and doing very similar things. We're talking to people directly about, what do you need? What are the problems you're facing? How can we work together to fix that? So definitely read up about Zapatistas there.
Well, and I wasn't going to read them, but since you mentioned it, I will, because they are awesome, right? Number one, lead by obeying. True leaders follow the will of the people, the desires of the larger community. Number two, propose, don't impose. Make proposals for community feedback rather than imposing rules without community input. Number three, represent, don't replace. Always represent the needs and views of the community at the table rather than standing as an individual in place of the community. Number four, anti-power against power. Demonstrate alternative power that challenges traditional forms of power. Number five, convince, don't defeat. Build power by convincing people towards just decisions rather than repressing people who disagree. Number six, everything for everyone, nothing for ourselves. Leaders are not in power to benefit themselves personally, but to fight for the benefits of everyone in the community. Number seven, construct, don't destroy. Exercise power to build a new world rather than focusing all energy on destruction or opposition. And number eight, we want a world where many worlds fit. Strong communities embrace diversity, and that is rather than needing to suppress those who don't fit into the norm, right? Like, those are all very much on point, right?
Those are basically our 10 key values.
Yeah, right. Those are like an organizing key values, right? And every single, and the bit I read was their heading and their principle, but then each one of them has a practice section too that talks about how they do it. So like a very, 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 very good model to think, to keep in our mind, and to avoid. We have to remember, right, that this is a minority group that's taking power, and they know what it's like to have been the repressed minority, and so they're really trying not to replicate that. Right, they're really trying to create a different type of world. And like, why do I bring up things like reading poetry from the city hall balconies after they storm city hall? It goes into that idea that I think too many socialists forget, and that's we need to be creating, right, and looking creatively and future focus in building as much as we need to be thinking about tearing down capitalism. If we tear down capitalism and we don't have a blueprint for what we want to create, if we're not creating, I think the idea that capitalism falls in one swift blow is pretty naive in and of itself. So as we bring down systems, right, we need to be creating their alternatives, or else we leave an opening for the capitalists to come back. Because if we take out the private health insurance companies, but we don't instill national health service and universal health care, now it just means that no one has any help affording their health care, right? We've got to put the replacement in place as well. We've got to create while we destroy. So, I wasn't planning on it, but since Garrett mentioned it, I think they are just on point organizing, principles. Pivoting from there to a very kind of similar, regional autonomy in Rojava, in Syria. We've got a couple pieces here. One is make Rojava green again. The other is building democracy without a state, that one looks at the Rojavan democratic confederalism, right? The bottom up democracy that they are trying to build. I do think that this is a very interesting case in that we have a leftist movement that's receiving support from the United States government, that's receiving arms from the United States government, right? Traditionally, the United States government, like we go down to the Latin American projects, Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia. Yep, we've tried to coup every one of them multiple times, right? We're constantly meddling in their politics. We're constantly trying to kill their projects. But in Rojava, within the Kurdish independent zones, we're actually supporting them, and it's another minority population that's kind of gotten autonomy and is trying to build something different. And so it's another good model for us to look at and to see how things play out, right? And some of the things I was asked about in a discussion of Medicare for All recently that Garrett probably saw, but I was asked about places like the Zapatistas and Rojava, right? And how were they providing healthcare? And in both those cases, they are trying to start their own healthcare systems. In the case of the Zapatistas, because it's very indigenous, they have local clinics that are very tied into traditional medicine, right? And then the larger cities in the region have more modern medical clinics that work and tie into very holistically with those small indigenous traditional clinics. And then because Mexico has a national health system, if their local can't provide, then there is a fallback, right? And Rojava has the same thing with Syria. There are still private hospitals. There is still a state system where if you need something that the small autonomous community can't provide, there's a safety net there, right? So these projects are in a way getting to do an experiment with a safety net in place, which is nice.
What I think is really cool, especially about Rojava, is that again, if you look at our previous live streams, Green Party and Ecosocialism, one inspiration for some of the early Greens was Murray Bookchin, and some Greens like Howie Hawkins worked with Bookchin to form the early Green Party and the left Greens and all. And Bookchin's ideas were a very bottom-up municipalist sort of approach to building an eco-socialist type of society. And Bookchin's writings inspired some of the folks in Rojava. And so there's kind of this direct connection between Bookchin and green politics to the style of government, for lack of a better term, that Rojava has developed, where they were influenced by Bookchin and green socialist politics of building up from this kind of municipal bases that really emphasize grassroots democracy and participation and building confederations of these municipalities that work together to provide that safety net like Chris was talking about. And you're supposed to look at that lens of green socialism through whatever your unique challenges are in your particular region or culture or whatever. And so it was adapted into something that was based in kind of Syrian culture, a Kurdish culture that kind of tried to compensate with things that they've been struggling with for a long time. That, for example, some parts of that region, just like we have in the U.S. and all, have this kind of very patriarchal sort of history. And so in order to try to address that, they've integrated into their system kind of checks and balances where there's, for example, a women's assembly that can veto things if they feel like the men in the General Assembly are trying to push things on women, so they're doing this experiment on how to do much more direct democracy and having these delegates that go to these confederal meetings that are split up in ways that can try to kind of counterbalance each other and make sure that minorities are heard, any issues, any concerns, right, are heard and built into the process and not left out of the process. So it's very fascinating to see this real time in general, because they're building this sort of socialist sort of society. But I think it's especially interesting for us Greens because this is one of the places we can point at and say, like, this is directly influenced by green politics, and where this goes and what we can learn from it is very fascinating.
And then, to pivot again to kind of manifestations of this within the United States, right? of municipalism, right? This idea that most of the power should be bottom up, should be based in our local communities, which is a complete inversion of what we have within our modern, in the U.S. especially, system with the federal government. I know the Republicans like to talk about states' rights, but state or federal, it's a top-down system, right? Whereas municipalism seeks to have a bottom-up system. One of the best ways I've kind of heard this expressed was actually in regards to Howie's 2020 healthcare plan, which was written in cooperation with Dr. Margaret Flowers, right? And the idea of a community-controlled national health service. In our present system, right, if you've got a top down, a number of X amount is determined to fund the medical system, right? Bottom down or below. And so it gets divvied up, and schools are another great example of this, right? There's a budget given and you get what you get and you have to make it work, right? It's a top down funding model. Whereas in a community controlled system, regional health boards, regional school boards would come up with the budget for what they needed, not with what they could make work, but with what they needed, and they sent that upward. And then things like tax rates were set in order to actually give them what they needed to succeed. And when you do it bottom up, it's a lot harder to have that kind of make do, right, type of policy. So although here in the U.S., Cooperation Jackson is probably the most well-known municipalist organization. They exist all over the country. There's whole solidarity economy organizations and municipalist organizations and all that kind of stuff, right? But it's kind of like a parallel power, right? Where they're trying to do economic development and sustainable development to get community ownership in play, and kind of flip how we do economic development, which is business first in the in the U.S. right now. So there are local manifestation of that. Then that we had the Ecosocialism or Death article from Kali Akuno earlier, and he's one of their leaders in Jackson. I'm sure they're very busy with the water crisis. Which, like, when a water crisis happens, that's when Cooperation Jackson isn't the government. Cooperation Jackson is the mutual aid, right? Is a way to think of it. And I think it's a good way to kind of process through how they fit.
Yeah, but it can eventually become the government if the government refuses to do anything and people align more with Cooperation Jackson. I think that's kind of the goal of any municipal movement, that you build these mutual aid networks that do a better job than government. And so people are like, why should I even pay attention to government anymore? Like, I have this thing I can participate in that's doing so much better.
And I think one of the reasons why, probably the main reason why Cooperation Jackson is the best known in the country, is because they are the ones who've been the most successful at that, right? They've got the deals with the government. They've moved the government on things, right? An example I often talk about from Illinois is an organization called Carbondale Spring. They're based out of Southern Illinois in a college town, but one of the reasons I bring them up usually is when they formed, they spent a year doing research. They didn't go out and organize. They didn't go out and have meetings and try to grow. They learned about their community. They did research on the city budget. They did research on the county budget. They did, deep dive research on the university, which was the cornerstone of the community, but is failing, right? And they bided their time, right? And so the first thing they came out with, one of their big issues was green energy and solar, getting solar installed and things like that. And so a organization or a company was going to come and build a solar plant, except they were going to put it in the middle of a working class community that didn't want it. They were going to push people out of affordable housing to build it, right? It was a development driven, not community driven, not need driven. It was development driven. And so the first action they actually took was killing a solar plant, despite the fact that one of their 4 pillars was, green energy. but it built this relationship with the community where they saw that they not only did they show up, but they essentially shot themselves in the foot because they heard the community's voice, and they'd rather, like the Zapatistas said, right, rather than pushing something on them, which they thought was good, which was green energy, they listened to the community and they said, we need green energy, but not here, right? And so then that gave them a little bit of a start. And then the local city council was debating a welcoming city referendum because Trump was coming to town to speak. And so they wanted their city council to say, we don't want Trump here. Sure, he's been invited. We can't stop him because he's speaking, private event, but we will put out a statement saying we don't welcome him or his, views here. Well, the city council waffled and tabled it, and they refused to act. So Carbondale Spring and members of the community went outside, declared the city council to have abdicated their duties as city leaders, and passed said proposal. Now, did the proposal actually pass and is on the books? No, it was completely a PR stunt, right? It was completely, but the newspaper covered it probably more than they would have covered the city council passing it, right? And a clear statement was made, and they've all of a sudden, and they've risen to a point where they've declared the city council to have abdicated their duties and that they're now in control. And they weren't in control, but it gave them this level of leverage and this level of visibility that all of a sudden they had the spotlight on them, and they were able to drop, like, here's our 4-point plan that we want to do. And when I'd spoken to them last a couple of years ago before the pandemic, the city was giving them acres upon acres of land and parks. The city to build permaculture gardens and farms. The city was paying for a farmer who would farm those farms and would train community organizers and community volunteers to run them so that the farmer could then go start another farm, right? They had tens of thousands of dollars from private and city funds put into a slush fund that was made so when a business was going out, they would help the workers buy it, right? To support worker ownership. They put, the police budget on the table in a very real way, right? They had agreements from local solar companies that they were charging premiums to people who could afford it so that they could get, lower prices for working class people to get solar. Right. So they were able to form this alternative power that was able to move the city government. Right. And it's always like with everything, it's an ebb and flow. But because they were ready, because they were prepared, because they were focused on these things, and because they built up those real life relationships, when all of a sudden the bucket was ready to be kicked over, they were able to do it, and they were able to get some really big things. Right. So it's important. The problems we face, y'all, they're huge. They're total. They're global, right? And so often it's overwhelming. And municipalism, like whether you agree with it or not, does offer a rosier view that we can actually affect change, right? It's much easier, I think, to get your local city council to push green energy as opposed to relying on the leaders at the COP27. Right.
Well, I think one lesson to take from municipalism is that whether you think it's enough or not, if you think maybe there needs to be some larger organization or whatever, you're still going to have to organize at community levels anyway. So this is absolutely where you start. And then where we go from there is up for discussion, and we need to try things and see what works. But we can really learn a lot from these movements.
And even if the Green Party is the prime example, even if you've already got that larger organization, right, the key to its health, the key to its growth, the key to its success is organizing at the local level, right? That larger organization is there to coordinate and help out and provide assistance and add efficiency, but the lifeblood of the organization is on the local level. Next up, Modibo Kadali on Pan-African social ecology, right? So very much like we talked about the first Ecosocialist International plan, right? Here's a Pan-African vision of an ecological future, right? So these aren't ideas. These aren't ideas that we in the West have, any kind of exclusive right to. It's in fact the opposite, right?
Yeah.
We live in the belly of the beast. We need to be listening to the experiences of those people suffering from our actions. We need to be looking to the global south, looking at the first Eco-Socialist International Plan, looking at the Pan-African Social Ecology Plan, right? And accommodating them and bringing them into, looking at the Red New Deal, right, out of the United States, which is an indigenous-led vision of, an ecological future. We shouldn't see these things as competing ideas to what we're talking about. We should be seeing them as, inspiration and things that we should be looking and taking really deep thought into as we here, like I said, in the belly of the beast, right? In one of the major polluting states. We need to be thinking about the downstream effects and, what our priorities are. Because our priorities should sync up with the priorities of the global south. They should, sync up with the people out that are suffering from our, opulence.
Yeah. What I'd add in there is that, we're kind of running out of time, but essentially, I think Kadali hits on this idea very similar to the Zapatistas in Mexico and the Kurds in Rojava. There's a very rich tradition and history of kind of grassroots democracy and communities coming together and making decisions together in Africa. That is the tradition in a lot of places. Kadali's talking about growing, kind of going back to those roots and growing this indigenous movement of based on those traditional African principles, but also looking at ecology and building a better world, beyond capitalism, where we fit in with nature and all. So it's really important.
As a Marxist too, like it's really important that we let local culture, local, conditions drive things, right? That they are centered, that it's not, kind of like the Zapatista principles that said that we're not trying to standardize, right? There is no standard solution. So it's really important that we're looking at these local manifestations of allied ideas and giving them weight and power. Another thing I'll say too, since we're talking Pan-Africa, they're not in here mainly because they tended towards the more traditional Marxist-Leninist projects that we've talked about in the past, right? In other ones, but Africa has had its fair share of liberation art, liberatory revolutionary movements, that we can learn from. Gaddafi is probably a key one to look at when you read the Little Green Book. It's something, whether it was played out or not, as written, is a whole other discussion. But it's a vision that is very much in line with what we're talking about, right? With a socialist view, and then Mbaba and Frantz Fanon, and there's numerous, Mandela, and there's numerous other examples, and in this case we chose the social ecology, but there's a long history of revolutionary and liberatory movements we can learn from in Africa, and then now a lot of the major socialist projects we were talked about are Latin American ones, right? Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia. There are just victories in Chile, and so we're Lula, or has Brazil gone to its Lula won, right? They did their follow-up.
Yeah, he did win. I'm not sure when they
Sorry, elections are just a blur in my head right now, right? But we're seeing a left movement again in the Latin American countries, and we can talk, and we're seeing the evolution of these projects, right? The Cuban in Cuba, they just passed a whole new section of laws on families that constitutionally protect gay rights and gay marriage and things like that, right? A few years ago, not few, but probably closer to 10 at this point, we saw a large part of the old guard in Cuba step down from their longtime leadership positions and say it's time to pass it on to another generation and see how that goes, right? So there's a lot, these are actual attempts and projects, right? And we can learn, man, from one of the things we can probably learn the most from the Latin American examples is how the capital will respond, right? We seize about a quarter of Venezuela's GDP every year, right? We seize $1 billion a year from Citgo, which is the Venezuelan, which is their oil company, right? So we can learn a lot from what we're going to have to deal with, right? Um, One of my favorite examples is in Venezuela is that they know we're going to accuse their election of being illegitimate. So they have created, in my opinion, the model of a modern election system. Now, a voting system can't get around corruption or political party repression or things like that are could be real criticisms that someone could have. But when it comes to actually casting in your vote in Venezuela, it's almost fraud proof. The results are almost immediate. They publicly audit 51% of the voting machines. Every party involved has to sign off, right? Guaido, who cried foul, and the U.S. tried to appoint him president, they didn't even run, right? Because they know that they can't say that it was an illegitimate election, because they know that we're going to say that. So they created a model of a modern system, right? So we can have our criticisms of these countries, right? We can have criticisms of Venezuela being a petrostate, right? We can have criticisms, especially in some of Cuba's past, right? But as socialists, we also need to have critical support. We need to support them against the attacks from the West and the attacks from capitalists, and we need to look at them and see where they succeeded, right? People say a lot of things about Venezuela, but they build more public housing than the United States does, with a fraction of the GDP and a fraction of the population, right? They've massively reduced poverty, right? Massively reduced illiteracy, right? So, and we also have to keep in mind when we're talking about all of these countries in the global South, in South America, South and Central America, and Africa and Asia, we're talking about post-colonialism too, right? They're still dealing with colonial ties. They're still dealing with bad deals from previous governments. Like Venezuela ships their oil to the United States to be processed. They don't have their own processing facilities because that was the deal that was made under pre-Bolivarian governments. So pre-Chavista governments. So we need to look at these and see what they're doing and see what's good, what's bad, but they offer a model.